In this video, I'd like to show you the solution I've come up with, having multiple forms on a page, differentiating between the different requests so that we apply visual changes only in the case of the transition that is actually related to that form. We'll also hold some state up here in the URL. And to start off, I'd like to introduce you to the two different types of forms that we have on this page, because this gutted button is actually a form. I want all of this to work without JavaScript, so this is an actual submit button with a hidden input that references the item. So we really have two different HTML forms on this page. And Remix can detect that each of them is in transition, like it's submitting data or it's fetching data in the background. But we have to differentiate which one is actually doing it so that we can show some visual feedback. I want all of this to work without JavaScript, but if JavaScript is available, I'd like to save the user one click, and that is why we auto-submit this section filter selection. And that's actually why I wanted to have some visual feedback to tell the user, we have clicked that button for you, you don't have to do that. I'm trying to detect if this form is in transition. I've also an additional timeout to not have it flash too quickly. But if the request takes even longer, we of course need to hook into this transition, and we do this with a use transition hook. But since we have multiple forms on the page and potentially multiple requests that are in transition, we have to identify that this transition is actually the one from this form. And to do this, I pass an extra hidden input with an action type, which I check up here. So only transitions originating from that very form will have an influence on how this submit button looks. Also, you can see the section ID up here in the URL, and the easiest way to get this one up here is to submit this form with get. But I needed to change this to a post request, and I'll tell you why. This hidden input would not be hidden in that case, but also appended to the URL as a carry parameter, and to be honest, I found this to be not ideal. But now here comes our next challenge. We actually want the section ID parameter up in the URL, so if we submit this form with a post, it won't get there automatically, but instead we have to put it there. And that is why in the action function of this route, I take the current request URL and manipulate this very parameter. If the request URL already contains a section ID, that is the one we are navigating away from, that is no problem at all, because the value inside form data will be applied and overridden. Finally, we redirect to that URL we just prepared. Inside this action function, you can see another thing I had to do to make this work. Since we now have multiple forms using a post request, we also have to differentiate inside the action method which form is submitting right now. I already showed you the hidden input passing an action type, and I added this to the other form on this page as well. So now up here in the action, I can decide what to do based on this inputs value. Now, one thing that came up is an implementation detail in Remix at this stage, which maybe will change in the future, and that is the request URL does not contain previously existing carry parameters. In this case, we're manipulating the section ID, but what if we had some other parameters as well? When the Remix form component does not have an action attribute specified, it will submit to the current route, cutting off all parameters. And that is why I have to work around it at this stage using the use location hook, building up the action from the path and the search parameters. Now, if we were to test this with another parameter, foo equals bar, and then switch to another section, we would still keep that foo equals bar in the URL. That would be the behavior of the native HTML element, and maybe we'll see a change in the Remix implementation in the future. To wrap it up, I'd like to quickly recap. We are holding that filter state in the URL. We post the filter form and then apply the changes within the action, manipulating the carry parameter. This allows us to send a hidden input as well, which will not show up in the URL. And that hidden input will help us identify which form has been submitting so that we can apply a visual change to our button only if the transition Remix detects at this point is really related to that form. and we can see the UI reflect that this filter form has automatically been submitted. But if I were to click this guarded button to put this cheese in our shopping cart, you would not see any change on this apply button up here. My goal with these videos is to keep it as concise as possible, and if you have any feedback or suggestions, please feel free to leave a comment. I'd really appreciate it, as I hope I can help you get started with Remix while I'm building this shopping list app and just showcase the problems I run into and the solutions I'm able to come up with. A big thank you and shout out to the Remix Discord community, which has been very helpful at that.